Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our CDS Lab Research Coordination Network webinar series. My name is Cecilia Dong. I'm the PI for this project, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Gerald Mills to give our webinar today. My colleague, Jeffrey Raven, will do the honor of the introduction. Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Cecilia and colleagues, and it's a huge honor to welcome Gerald Mills, Dr. Gerald Mills, who will be speaking to us today about on the subject of creating climate resilient cities. Gerald Mills is a global expert on this topic of microclimates, and he's a geographer with expertise on the urban environment and on climate of cities in particular. And he has published extensively many aspects of urban climate and is co-author of publication Urban Climates. His work focuses on the development of global database on cities that's suited for urban climate studies as part of the World Urban Access Portal tools, which is a mouthful, but it's an absolutely critical and innovative tool that Gerald has been working on for a number of years, and it's really a way, and I know he'll speak about it, but it's a sort of a way of cataloging urban form in relationship to climate. He's a member of the World Meteorological Association's team that's developing the Integrated Urban Services Strategies to enable the UN Urban Agenda Program. And he's been involved with the International Association of Urban Climates, IAUC, since its foundation in 2000 and has served as president. Gerald was also a lead author for the assessment report of climate change in cities, planning and urban design chapter with me. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Just on a personal note, I have followed Gerald Mills's work for many years, from really maybe around 13, 14 years. And he and his colleagues who have been involved in this topic are really pioneers. The work that Gerald does is absolutely critical in terms of how cities actually shape and create microclimates that have huge impacts in urban health, quality of life, and energy use, and on and on. And I had an epiphany when I went to visit, I was at a conference, after having followed Gerald's work, I was at a conference in Manchester back in maybe around 2010 or a little bit before that. And Gerald's presentation was really looking at urban morphology, three-dimensional form, and the relationship between three-dimensional form and climate. And there was a really a kind of an epiphany there where, as an urban designer and architect, I realized the incredible connections that we have in terms of how form making drives climate. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Gerald to the podium. And Gerald, and we'll have Q&A afterwards.
First of all, thank you very much. You're way too generous. I hope I get the pitch right for the discussion. I have to say, I'm a physical geographer. By the way, I'm talking to you from a room in UCD, which is University College Dublin in Ireland. I'm afraid I'm I'm completely institutionalized. I only feel comfortable if I'm teaching, where I can stand and move around. And so for my students, unfortunately, they have to suffer by watching me basically duplicate the lecturing experience, because Right now, the university is completely closed. So in my classes, what I'm really interested in as a physical geographer is I find typically physical geographers look at what's often described as the natural world, and they try to understand the process by which it functions. My interest is in the climates of cities, and I'm particularly interested as a geographer because they are the places that we made. And I find it fascinating that we know so little about the places that we actually made. I think you can look at the city essentially as a combination of indoor and outdoor climates. And there's this constant battle going on, trying to create an indoor climate suited to its needs, often by isolating itself from the outdoor climate. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try and talk about the field itself and what we know about it in the most general terms possible, but I'm going to try and link it into global climate change, which of course is a big driver behind this idea of resilient cities. Now, there's lots of terms that I use in my classes with students on cities: resilient, green, zero carbon, sustainable, and it goes on and on. Now, what do I take resilient to be? Well, generally speaking, I take it to be some form of robustness, ability to cope with various types of shocks through a variety of different mechanisms, which might involve design. It might involve technology, like in a smart city to be aware of things. Design in the sense that you might be able to design the city better to be more pleasant, but also in how it functions. And that often means the individuals who occupy the city. So I think this is what makes the environment interesting, because clearly the spaces are made by people, but people actually occupy different spaces according to their needs. So the example picture here is a form of resilience. Here the people simply sleep on the roof when it gets too hot, which is a perfectly normal thing to do in a climate where you can't afford air conditioning. You use the natural air conditioning, which of course is access the sky at night time to allow yourself to cool down. In many parts of the world, this is a very common approach to dealing with excessive warming, is simply to utilize the rooftop space to achieve some form of comfort. Modern equivalent to this, of course, would be to separate yourself from the outdoors by simply conditioning the inside of the house and creating an internal climate which is entirely divorced from the outside. So this is what I intend to do. First of all, let me just say that I think that the definition of resilience or the quality of resilient cities, I'll use part of this. This is the Rockefeller Foundation description of the quality of resilient systems. They talk about systems that are reflective, which means they're not fixed. They're always constantly adjusting, which of course is quite difficult in cities because once they're laid down in place, they're often very difficult to modify. Systems that are robust, that don't rely on one solution, but actually have lots of capacity to actually adapt, redundancy, flexibility, that they're approachable to, they are amenable to change when needs be, resourcefulness, as we've just seen. Inclusion, I think, is very important. That's what I've learned in my time as a physical geographer trying to make changes in the city, that some of the changes I'm most interested in requires the involvement of the communities themselves. And I've learned that also by working with Jeffrey, that the most effective solutions are ones which have buy-in from the communities. And I think critically, as I talk about all the various bits and pieces about how a city functions from a climatic point of view, it's about integration. And I'll come to that at the very end, because if you look at how most cities operate, certainly in the developed world, we might have a system set up to look at air quality, another system set up at water quality and about issues associated with waste, another system associated with flooding, another system associated with weather. Well, you'd be surprised to learn that often these systems aren't actually integrated to each other. They don't even share data. So if we're going to have a resilient city, then we need to certainly have urban systems that are capable of integrating across the boundaries. And this is relevant, I think, because if I look at climate management, the climate management is going to rapidly change from where we have currently been managing the climate in cities, which is in the mid-latitudes, which are relatively moderate climates. Here they're indicated by sea climates. Sea climates are basically where most of the population of the world live at the moment. Sea climates have relatively moderate winters and moderate summers. They tend to be in the past the place that produces most of the food. The Red climates you see there are the tropical climates. That's where the population growth is occurring. That's where the big cities of the future will appear. These climates will have a big need for some form of climate management, which is associated with cooling rather than heating. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Turns out that most of our knowledge about urban systems is based almost entirely on cities based in sea climates. We have very little knowledge about cities located in A climates, even though we know that's where the knowledge is going to be used. So my organization is just to talk about climate science, support resilience planning, and I'll focus particularly on cities. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we know about the climates in cities and how we know it. And I'll tell you a little bit about the status of urban climate science, where we are now, and then what the obstacles are that I see, the gaps in our knowledge that prevent us or inhibit us from using it. And I'll draw on 3 books. The first is the IPCC's census report, which is the global climate change perspective. At the other end of the scale, I'll put urban climates. That's the climates inside cities themselves. And I placed in between it the book that Jeffrey was talking about, which is almost like an assessment report for cities, which talks about trying to take the ideas from the global climate change, being fully aware of what's happening inside the cities to address the needs of cities. Now, what you'll see, I think, in the science stuff is that the science has gotten better and better. And in many respects, it's gotten better and better by simply eliminating the geographically specific and looking for general properties. So what we've done now is we've assembled the science, but now the challenge is to actually apply it. So here's the first thing I'll show, is that climate is organized at different scales. And that means that whatever interaction you have with the climate is all scale dependent. When I get down to what's referred to as the mesoscale, the scale essentially of thunderstorms, tornadoes, thermals, turbulence, those are the scales inside the city. The city sits inside another framework which is driven by the synoptic scale systems, which are much bigger than the city itself. And of course, they sit within global climate systems, which include seasonal changes, things like ENSO, etc. So if I took the top part of that chart, that's where atmospheric science has been focused for the last 50, 60 years. It's largely about trying to understand those global climate systems. And to some extent, in order to understand that, using the tools they had, they parameterized or eliminated all the stuff that was lower than that. On the urban side, we usually start at the size of the meso or micro and try to assemble what's happening at the city scale. And now the challenge is to try and integrate those two things to bring them together. From a global climate change perspective, then, you can also talk about the scale of decision making, because we end up with global climate change because of the multitude of decisions made at all these different scales. So at the very, very small scale, we have the individual themselves making decisions about the house, the heating, the transport. Then there's at the neighborhood scale where those things get arranged, where decisions are made about the mixture of the landscape, either explicitly or implicitly.
When you guys no.
So it's sort of neighborhoods make up the city, and the city itself has got lots of different types of neighborhoods, some of which are set aside for particular purposes, like, say, for example, warehouse areas, industrial areas, residential areas, in many Western cities. Then out of that, we had the connections between the cities that make up the region and the nation, and then eventually, of course, we get up to the global system itself. So I want you to just be aware is that the science has tackled each of these different stages at different scales, but they haven't necessarily coordinated actions across the scales. Here's the thing, more than half the planet live in cities. Cities, taken as a whole, occupy less than 3% of the land area of the world. So when the major drivers associated with climate change are the functioning of cities. So if I want to address climate change, a very good place to start with is with the cities themselves. Cities are the sources of most of the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. But if you look at where cities are located, they tend to be located in particularly risky areas. They're close to sea level, they're often in valleys, which means that they experience things like poor air quality, and they're often in coastal areas, which means they experience storms. So for two reasons, it's a good idea to focus on cities because they're at risk, because they're sources of emissions. This is the risk model they use in the IPCC report, which I always find very useful because on the right-hand side, it indicates socioeconomic pathways, which is essentially the wealth of the city, the adaptation and mitigation actions, and the governance, how it's managed. These all change two things. They change the land use and the emissions. Now, here's the interesting thing. If I was to look at the global scale, it's the emissions that actually drive global climate change. But if I were to look at a city scale, it's largely the land use change that govern the profound changes to the climate experience inside cities. So those that integrated picture of risk there basically describes why cities are so relevant. In fact, this is illustrated in the IPCC report itself, which, by the way, the cities are only in place inside these projections simply because of the emissions. They don't exist in the models. So cities are too small to be included in these global climate models. Nevertheless, they conclude that many of the global risks, is the assessment report, the fifth one, of climate change are concentrated in urban areas. Steps to build resilience and enable sustainable development can accelerate successful climate adaptation globally. So in other words, that we should be much more focused on cities themselves. Now, the sixth assessment report will include cities more explicitly, and the seventh one, I'm told, they're working on the models that will explicitly include cities in the models themselves. In other words, it will be possible then to start simulating outcomes, not generically, but outcomes for the city. And I think this is the problem we have with a lot of the global climate change stuff, is that what we get are our general outcomes, but then our difficulties to actually apply them specifically to the places that we occupy. So what does it suggest? Well, warming, more intense precipitation, potentially increased tropical cyclone activity, and of course, higher sea levels. Each of these then have specific impacts in cities. It may mean, for example, that some of the cities in the sea climates now have to spend less energy on heating during winter, but the big impact will be in increased demand for energy for cooling. In some instances, the heat levels are sufficient, certainly when they're added to the city changes, to actually push people into the area of significant heat stress. So that what was previously a warm event now becomes a heat wave. Much of our infrastructure obviously has been set up for a climate that might change in the future. So the pipe systems are of a given dimension. The access to water has certain expectations. All those things will change if the background climate changes. Okay. So what about cities? Now, the other end of the scale. Well, the diagram you see in the upper left-hand corner there shows you how the city actually changes its climate. Now, the part I want you to focus on here is there's only one part of this that actually has people in it, and it's the microscale. Because this is the outdoor spaces and this is the indoor spaces. All the stuff that's generated at the microscale gets washed up into the overlying atmosphere. And at the local scale, we start to see the different impacts of neighborhoods. And then I've added all the neighborhoods to make up the city. Then lo and behold, I get that mesoscale picture. And that is the contribution, that big pool of air leaving the city that contributes to global climate change. So when we talk about resilience to the city, we're trying and limit the influence of the city on the overlying atmosphere and cut off its link with the global. What causes climate change in a city? Well, fundamentally, it's associated with how they're constructed. The removal of vegetation, the replacement by paving, the choice of materials, whether it be asphalt, concrete, brick, stone, glass, steel, etc., all of which have extremely peculiar properties, and geometry. Now, geometry is what you see on the right-hand side here. This is a picture of an alley in Singapore. The geometry is the space between the top of the buildings and the ground itself. That's the zone of human occupation. And the geometry affects everything. It affects access to light, skylight, affects the circulation of wind, affects the ventilation of air in the street, etc. And then there are urban functions. So urban form basically will produce a climate, even if you have nobody in the city. But of course, it's a constant demand for stuff in the city that drives the resource use and the waste generation. I chose this diagram of Singapore because it shows that every single building here is essentially a refrigerator. Every one of them has an air conditioning system at the back of the building to create an indoor climate separate from the outdoor climate. What do we know about cities? Well, they've been studied in terms of their climate effects for maybe 200 years, but I have to say, scientifically, really, they've only been studied in any sort of comprehensive way in the last 50 years. And that in terms of investigation, in terms of scientific enterprises, the investigation of city landscapes is pathetically small in terms of science when you compare it against global climate change. To the point where we have very, very few observations in cities. We actually no sophisticated observations on cities outside of wealthy cities. We've next to no information about the cities. We don't know how they're built. We don't know their layouts. We have no comprehensive description of the landscapes in which cities are found. Now, this makes it extremely difficult to see what the impact of the nature of urban form and functions in a given city will be on that climate. So what would a perfect urban climate science be that you would have a set of tools to go about your work? Well, certainly you need the infrastructure, and that means observations, a framework for analysis, understanding processes, and ideally the simulation tools. Now, I'm going to argue that many of those things are in place. They might not all be connected yet, but most of those things are in place. Then you need to be able to communicate. So in order for me to talk to somebody else about a city, we all have to agree on the language. One thing that urban climatologists have found to their detriment is that having spent years talking about urban and rural, nobody actually agreed what urban was and nobody agreed what rural was. In fact, in the case of the early phase of urban climatology, Europeans would use the terms like suburban. The Japanese had no idea what they were talking about because there was no equivalent. So in order to have a conversation, you actually have to agree on the nature of the landscape. It's only very recently that we're starting to come to grips with exactly that problem. How do we actually say this type of landscape is of this type and have somebody else understand what that means? So the gaps in the field are the application. That remains the case. I've chosen two examples here. One is, of course, the famous green roof in Chicago. The other is the white roofs in New York. It's interesting, both of these are roof level interventions. It is very, very, I'm not convinced that it affects people on the ground. So from a satellite point of view, you've achieved a lot, but as to whether it actually affects life on the ground in between those buildings, it's less convincing. And we haven't done a great deal of evaluation. We've done very little of prior and then post-change evaluation to see what the impact of those actions are. So you might say, why has science done such a bad job? Well, partly because of the nature of the problem. It's a very, very difficult place to make a measurement. How would you start? This is Tokyo. Where would you make a measurement that's anyway representative? Increasingly, what scientists have found is that either they pick out parts of the landscape here that they say is duplicated and study those in detail. So you pick out a tall section of buildings, you pick out a relatively small section of buildings, you pick out a park, and you take all those different microclimates, you try to add them all up. Or you do something else. You put an instrument in this system here, which is not in between the buildings, but you treat all those buildings as though they're almost like blades of grass. And then you put your instruments well above the blades of grass, and you measure the integrated flow of stuff coming out of that city. So it's been extremely difficult to try and grapple with this, because if you look at most of science, certainly science that looks at exchange between the surface and the atmosphere, the first thing they did was they said, okay, we need to find a homogeneous zone. So that means that I can make a measurement here and it's representative of the area. But that's next to impossible to do with this. What's urban? This is suburb of Chicago. Chicago is quite interesting. It's a very big city. But I'll be honest with you, you took a satellite picture of Chicago, I'd say about 80% of it looks like a big forest. There's the entire urban infrastructure all hiding beneath the canopy below. So there's a system that behaves very much like a natural system. The inputs into the system, the urban system here, are actually quite light. The urban heat island effect, for example, would be very, very small, but the city is extensive. And this is my favorite picture because this is actual life. This is people now inside the system. So this is Cairo. The buildings on either side, all the windows are open to keep the rooms ventilated. But of course, you can see that the entire space is completely being fumigated by all the cars, vehicles, motorbikes moving down the street. At the same time, you have people gathering around, they're selling food. So this is the scale at which we actually occupy. So whenever we think about the global scale, this is the level at which those ideas get implemented. This has always been the challenge. Here's one of the most ubiquitous effects of all cities. It's called the urban heat island. And it means simply that if I were to measure the temperature from the outside the city as I go to the interior, the atmosphere gets warmer and warmer. And the atmosphere gets warmer and warmer, particularly at nighttime. So on the bottom left-hand side is a famous redrawn map from Ernesto Guardiega, worked in Mexico City. This map is from 1973. There's 11-degree difference, Celsius difference between the inside the city and the outside the city. Now this admittedly is a night, it's in the autumn, it's clear skies and next to no wind. That's when you get the strongest heat island. But that's a massive change in temperature over such a short distance. All of it because of how the city is constructed. Now, a lot of the stuff you see in the global climate change literature always focuses on the urban heat island because, of course, it adds to what's known as the global warming. So the feeling would be that this would actually trick people into making a heat stressful environment. But I would urge people to take a far more nuanced approach to this. The urban heat island is measured against the base temperature. So the question you have to ask yourself is whether the base temperature is high or low. So it is about the level of heat rather than necessarily the urban heat island that really makes a difference to your health. For example, in my climate, here in Dublin and Ireland, it'd be very, very difficult for me to argue to restructure the city in order to accommodate or take care of the urban heat island. Nobody in this city would think that raising the temperature by a few degrees is a problem. Whereas in another city, it might be a problem. A place like Singapore, for example, which already has a very high temperature, the effect of the heat island could be quite dramatic. So I think actually urban climate science has managed to deal with a lot of these problems. It's getting better and better at it, and we're getting more and more information. So for example, here's a set of measurements that were made above the urban landscape at a bunch of cities in the mid-latitudes. These cities are in America, they're in Europe, they're in Japan, and there might be a couple in Singapore. And what it shows is that the critical factor controlling the link between the city and the outdoor environment in terms of heating, which is a good measure as to how urbanized it is linked very strongly to the vegetative factor. So if you look at 50% there on the bottom axis, it corresponds almost exactly to a value which is 0.5 on the left-hand axis. And that 0.5 indicates that about half the energy is put into heating the atmosphere and about half that goes into evaporation. If I bump up the the vegetative area, I can increase the amount of evaporation. If I decrease the vegetation, more and more of the energy goes into heating up the overlying atmosphere. So there's a very, very simple thing. If I want to improve the urban environment, and if heat is a particular issue, vegetate the landscape. The more I give for vegetate the landscape in terms of area, the less of the energy in the city goes into heating up the overlying area. It's strange. This is 20 years worth of work. So it might seem very obvious, but we had to wait 20 years to actually get the information to show that what you suspected is in fact the case. Vegetating the city is a good idea. But where are we at? I've put a spectrum here just to put these ideas together. You're all very familiar with the global atmospheric models, which have these grid cells. These grid cells are of a given size. What they try to do is capture all the processes within that cell. The cell itself, once you've decided on the cell, you've also decided on how you're going to parameterize or make guesses about what's happening inside that cell, because you're not going to resolve the details precisely. What's happening in the global climate models is as they get better and better, as they progress, they include more and more physics, more and more processes, and the cells get smaller and smaller. Nevertheless, they're going to have a completely revamped system if they want to include cities directly in these models. So traditionally what we do is we have another set of models which are based upon the same principles and they are applied to a region. These are often used to look at, for example, regional scale air pollution. Then we have another set of models which are called mesoscale models. And these are often used to look at urban areas. So for example, if you do happen to read the literature, you'll often see the weather research forecasting model being used. And WRF, it's referred to, exists now in what they refer to as an urbanized form. And if you run WRF at an urban scale, most people run it down to a square kilometre. So that means that the smallest item you're going to get inside that model is going to be an information for a square kilometre. There are other models that have been developed almost separately. These are called neighbourhood models. These are probably the most recent sorts of models. They include things like, for example, urban building energy models that actually look at links between buildings, but they're still quite new. And then, of course, the building scale, for many, many years, we've had architectural models and building energy models. But that's your scientific enterprise across the range. Models exist at each of these scales now, but they don't necessarily talk to each other. So typically what happens is people run a global model. If they want more precise information, they nest a regional model inside it. They nest an urban model inside it, and that gives you the outcome. And then the architect would take the information from that, might be in the form of an urbanized weather model, to try and run a building model to tell you what the implications will be for climate change. So there's our future, is to try and link all this knowledge across all those scales. And I think it's a bit of a challenge, but what I can see about the development of some of these models, they're quite clever, and I get the sense from some of them they're ready to shift away from a regular grid to a variable grid, which means you can have very, very small grids over big cities like London, Paris, New York, and then wider grids where there's less need for such detail. So I think the science is in place. Now, the only reason it's gotten this far, I just want to emphasize this, is by basically ignoring geography. Because what they've done is the models have worked because we've stripped down the cities to their bare essentials. And in that bare essentials, I can now predict the processes that give rise to the outcomes. Here's the challenge now, is actually to put a real city into that system and actually generate information that I could use. So if I were to talk about these things, I would say, first of all, existing cities and retrofits or climate rehabilitation is entirely different from starting from scratch. So we're probably going to need different approaches for different types of places. So the cities of Western Europe definitely fall into existing settlements. There it's about refurbishment, about modifying. In my particular city, because I do work similar to Jeffrey in looking at urban scale building energy models, 30% of the building stock was built before there was any energy regulations at all. So you have a choice. Do I knock them and start from scratch, or do I figure out some way of actually rehabilitating it? London, Paris be pretty much the same. We have the link policy, obviously, to the outcome. So I think we have to be much more explicit about what we want out of the system in order to get the policy right. I think scale is critical. More than anything else, I'd say scale is always at the heart of it. When the challenge we face is to meet goals simultaneously, and that's why we do need integration. There's not much point in me figuring out that I need to vegetate the landscape and ignoring air quality. With the constant debates I have with the work I do in Dublin, is people say, well, if we plant more trees, we can offset the climate problems. And I keep pointing out that you will never, ever plant enough trees to take care of the emissions from cars. It's not going to happen. So the only way you can actually get the outcomes you want is by removing cars and planting trees together. But you won't get it through one pathway alone. And I'm convinced that urban design, the types of work that Jeffrey does and the New York Institute of Technology do is essential to matching the scales. I'm convinced of that. Scale is critical. I picked that one example out here. We often talk about resilience as though it's something new. This is, of course, the flood control wall on the Thames River in London. It does two things. It stops ocean water coming in, but it also tries to release river water whenever there's a possibility of river flooding. What people forget is that this was never built to take care of climate change. This was built after a massive flood in the 1950s to try and protect the City of London. Now, you could argue that, in fact, once it's been in place, they've actually constructed parts of the city that have made it less resilient. But we can often build resilience by looking to the past rather than necessarily looking to the future. And there's enough evidence, as we saw in New York with Hurricane Sandy, to draw evidence in the past to figure out ways that we can make the city more resilient. This is Solar City. This is Freiburg in Germany. This is about scale. It's about policy action. The only way you can get all these buildings to have access to that solar energy is if they all agree on a given height and a given facade, so they can all accumulate the energy without interfering with everybody else. So it does take a degree of interaction to ensure that happens. I said design is important. This is a lovely way of actually controlling heat in the city of Malaga. Very ancient concept. We've seen it outside buildings with individual little screens. Simply putting a screen over the street suddenly makes the outdoor space occupiable. This forces people out of the buildings because they would naturally like the space, rather than to stay indoors in air-conditioned spaces. So I regard design, clever design, as well, it's essential to achieving some form of resilience. This is the city of Nîmes in France, which I had an opportunity to visit. Not for any reason other than the fact that it was on a railway track, but I was really surprised at how they incorporated water and vegetation. It's quite a hot Mediterranean climate, but they effectively utilised what's often referred to as green and blue infrastructure to accomplish outdoor spaces that are very, very comfortable. So I thought that, generally speaking, vegetation and water are the two tools at your disposal to actually alter unwanted urban effects. So what are the gaps or what are the obstacles I see to actually making progress? The picture I have here is from work that myself and colleagues did. I provided the inventory of trees, and then we worked with the local community who were in quite a hard landscape part of Dublin to talk about how they green their own landscape. Interestingly enough, especially with the COVID circumstances, they were not remotely interested in climate change. But what they were interested in was reducing traffic and have access to green spaces for mental health. The science is maturing. The models need to be integrated. The models themselves need to be much easier if they're going to provide guidance, because right now you have to be very, very sophisticated to run some of these models, to have all the parameters and understand what's happening. Here's my big problem, and Jeffrey made a mention of it, is that we now have extremely sophisticated models, but they all need data to run. And it is almost impossible to get data. Sometimes because governments won't release it, sometimes because it's never been gathered, or because it's in a hodgepodge and it varies towards a scale. So it's next to impossible, even though I've got a very sophisticated model, without putting an awful lot of work in to actually run that model. So if you think of the model itself as basically systematic knowledge, all contained in a set of equations, then you can't actually extract any without any urban data. And we do need supporting observations. Too long, meteorological organizations, they don't measure inside cities, largely because it goes against what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be taking measurements so they know about the regional climate. So if there was a station inside a city and they felt it was being contaminated by the city, it was removed. Now, this is a very strange thing. That means you're removing the evidence you need at a city scale to make decisions at that scale. If the science exists, then it needs to be integrated with something called urban services. That means across the board urban services, air quality, energy management, etc. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Almost certainly, new services need to be created. I think the meteorological organizations are only realizing this, is that the types of services they provided in the past are not necessarily fitted to achieving the results you want now. So the sorts of information, for example, a planner might want is not the same information. They need information over a longer period of time. They need information about climate change. Whereas most of the users currently of meteorological services are all interested in day-to-day forecasting. And of course, we need the tools, the soft tools to transfer the knowledge into practice. And then I finally say that applications need to be evaluated. Green infrastructure, great, but can we show the benefits before and after? Can we apply solutions that are specific to a place? One of the great advantages, as I say, of the science is it's ubiquitous. In fact, it's generic. The challenge now, I think, is to take that science and actually apply it to a place that I occupy. Now, the only way that transfer can occur is with decent data. So they're the last things I want to finish off by talking about in terms of the gaps. What do I mean by data? Well, this is how scientists running these models see the world. What they try to do is they simplify, as I said, strip it down to its basic essentials. These are what they describe as their parameters or descriptors of the landscape. They tell you about what proportion of the landscape is built upon. So that one up there on the upper left, A, urban cover, lambda B, the proportion of landscape that's built, the portion of landscape that's vegetated, the portion of landscape that's impermeable. Now, that alone tells you a great deal about the behavior of the system. What else do I have? I have F there, the height to width ratio. There's your geometry. That's the height of buildings and the separation between them. So the climate in New York is completely different, say, for example, than the climate in London, not simply because they occupy different climate zones, but look at the scale of the city streets in New York in terms of their width and their height. And now if you go to the city centre of London, they have none of those boundaries in place. So the heights of the buildings don't seem to have any relationship to the width. Hong Kong is another example where it's truly a vertical city. Same heights of buildings typically that you might get in central New York, but the width of the streets is completely different. We need this data obviously for the places we occupy, particularly for the places for which there's absolutely no infrastructure in place, and that generally speaking are the cities outside of Europe, North America, Japan, and China. Part of the reason that I got involved in this idea of creating a database, this is called the World Urban Data Access Portal Tools. The idea that we create a uniform set of data against which we could compare one city to another. So the simple example here uses a system called local climate zones. It's the first step in the process, local climate zones to characterize a city. And the city I've shown you here is the city of Milan. By the way, there is the boundary of the city, which is always one of our problems. The boundary of the city, of course, does not correspond to the built-up area of Milan at all. Now, it turns out the product is very, very good. Now, we did that over the course of the weekend. So there's no reason why using the science infrastructure that's there, the satellites, etc., that you could not start to put together databases that's valuable enough to run models. We've already shown that you use the information from an image like this, derive the parameters from it, and then run a model like WRF. I'm going to show you this one. One of the challenges we face is how are we going to get to the next level, down to the neighborhood? This is what we call a digital synthetic city. And what they're using is gaming technology to pull down, as you can see, open street roads here. They're going to put down satellite images. They're going to use geographic rules about density, about green spaces, etc. And from that, they're going to actually start generating a fake set of buildings. Now, I think for us, going forward in terms of generating stuff at a neighborhood level, this offers tremendous potential because it means that I can upgrade, add new data very, very quickly. I think there's either Chicago or New Orleans, sorry. So what they do is we've started to just do tests with this, comparing a fake city with a real city. So here's fake San Francisco, with that lovely shift in the orientation of the streets. Now here's the thing, it wouldn't be good enough for building analysis, but it'd be good enough for neighborhood analysis. And suddenly you'd have the texture that you need to actually apply these models that do exist, because you can generate the data from this synthetic city. Okay. There's a nice timing for this project, your project, because the idea of integrating services actually come center stage at the World Meteorological Organization, where they're very interested in developing what they refer to as integrated urban services. So that would mean that you'd have a platform across which there's sharing. And that platform wouldn't be just a science platform, it'll be a platform that has to engage with stakeholders, and those stakeholders would say, these are the tools we need. And it would be up to them, the cities themselves, to generate the services required by the users. So we're trying to come up with a framework to allow this to be transferable from one place to another. The idea, however, is in the heart of it there, you can see the observations, modeling, and assessment. But the identification of end users, that's fundamentally got to do with conversations between the stakeholders in the city, which include citizens, and the providers of the services. A big part of it is about impact prediction and risk warning, about evaluation, communication outreach, and continual capacity development, and going back to the start to figure out what's working, what's not working. There are examples. In fact, if you look up the WMO, there's 2 books on this. The first was a sort of model. That's where I took this image from. The second one was about demonstration cities. So this was the example that was provided by a very well-known scientist called Gerald Mills, and he presented the strategy for Beijing. So this is an entire service developed around the city of Beijing, which of course makes sense given its population is bigger than most countries. And you can see they have the research part, the impacts of precipitation, fog and haze, which are particular issues, develop rapid, refresh, multi-scale analysis prediction system, integrated urban services. What are they interested in? Hydro services, traffic services, energy services, city management, housing and land. So they're trying to come up with an integrated system to actually look at the city as an entity and to have the science in place that can actually support the decision making. Okay, that's what I've tried to do, is try to put things in a frame. I always like this picture here because it speaks to sort of what we thought we could achieve in the 1960s and 1950s. Science would accomplish everything. We could have put a dome over Manhattan and have an indoor-outdoor climate stretching over the entire city. Clearly, if we want to achieve resilience, we have to have communication, because I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all. And if there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, then we have to use what we know generically and then apply it to specific places. I think a lot of the tools are available, though I think they're quite sophisticated at the moment and require an awful lot of work. They have to improve, they have to get talking to each other, they have to become simpler to use, but fundamentally, they have to be applied and tested. And the only way they're going to be applied and tested is we have information about the real places that people occupy, and we put them in, do applications, and then test to see if they work. So I hope that's okay. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Gerald. It's, as always, a lot of food for thought. I think you've already said it. You had a very compelling slide which showed waste heat in relationship to the surrounding climate that has knock-on effect on not only poor air quality, but certainly the waste heat is coming from air conditioning, right? Increased air conditioning use. So it becomes a vicious cycle where you're heating up the urban canyon at the same time as using more energy. So my question is, from the energy perspective, from a water perspective, with respect, I was very interested in the Malaga example, where a northern city might achieve what you showed in Malaga, Spain, through tree canopy cover. But Malaga is a hot and fairly arid area, so they achieve it through either street furniture or, in that particular case, some sort of a cover over the street. So I'm curious about that relationship also on the water side, where cities are grappling with the need for additional tree canopy cover, but they don't have the water for it. And then with respect to food, The image that you showed of Chicago and the sort of sprawl of Chicago, taken to its extreme, you could imagine a situation where you have a regional, sprawling regional form, right? While it might reduce the specific microclimate in a particular location in that city, because you've got a more sprawled out situation where you have, as you showed at Chicago, tree canopy cover over the street, and it almost looked like a forest, as you said, right? But taken to an extreme, if you were to spread that out over the region, gobble up farmland, for example, that produces local food production, what would be a kind of value proposition? What would be the value of pushing against that as a through the lens of climate science? So that's kind of three. There's the energy, water, and food angle that I was curious for you to make the link to.
Well, I have difficulty making an easy link to food, unless you just simply say that landscape which is taken over by the city is no longer available for food. But that's the argument for making a city more compact, higher built density, higher population density. I think you're absolutely right. The city of Chicago or Miami, I think, is an even worse example. You can diminish the urban effect, the local microscale effect, by simply spreading out the city. But the consequence of that for climate change at another scale are certainly off the chart. So there's obviously some sort of a sweet spot between trying to make the city a given size so that you don't dramatically affect the climate inside the city, and at the same time modulate your impact on the bigger climate. I think that cutoff point is going to be different for cities in different parts of the world. In other words, I don't think there's a universal solution. Compact, high-density cities, everything I've seen tells me they're more energy efficient. I've never seen anybody that's actually counter. The flip side is they don't all, if they're badly done, they can also make life inside the city dislikable. In other words, people don't want to have that life. So, for example, we've seen ourselves in Hong Kong, some of the consequences that people pay for such high density. Basically, you purchase your climate. The more money you have, the higher you go in the apparatus, and the more air conditioning you get. It's a constant challenge. I know my particular climate, people keep saying, well, why can't we have high density and high buildings like New York? I keep saying New York has the same latitude as Athens in Greece. We're 53 degrees north. You have any idea what that 1,000 kilometers has in terms of the effect in winter, in terms of the generation of the shadow? So we do need different solutions in different places. You're absolutely right. This is why I would say there are no universals. So I showed the picture of Malaga because one of the big things about urban is that the big push in the future in urban areas is going to be in hot climates. And there's no doubt that in a very, very hot climate, especially if it's arid, water is the best way of resolving the problem, except that's the one resource that you don't have. So then you have to look at other forms of devices, like those simple shading techniques, are using certain types of very, very water that are exceptionally good at retaining water and not actually shedding it. And you have to be very, very strategic because you can't do what you could do in this climate here, which is plant trees everywhere. Here, in this climate here, I would say shelter is probably the biggest issue for people using outdoor spaces. And if you improve the outdoor space, you do get all sorts of side effects because if people use more outdoors, that means they're going to use less indoors, which is where the demand is for all the heating energy. I think too long we've actually seen these as two separate things. I'd much prefer if we saw the urban landscapes consisting of the indoors and outdoors and trying to make it as easy as possible to move back and forth. So anytime we really have to regulate it, even in a climate like this, yeah, it gets cold, but it's not so cold that you're actually going to suffer from being outdoors. That's true for all the climates in the world, that it wouldn't take a great deal of design management to get people outdoors. And here's the other thing we found, is we know that people go outdoors not simply on the basis of temperature, but also on the basis of the quality of the environment. So even having trees outdoors or small parks in the area has a big impact on people's use of the space. I don't know what it was like in New York, but I can tell you in this country here, all of a sudden people discovered they didn't like the neighborhoods they were in. There was no parks. They couldn't take the kids out anywhere. One of the consequences of COVID has been suddenly to change the occupation of urban space. There's now there's now fewer parking spaces, now more plantings in streets. And I think that that's a good outcome. There was a third question there, sorry. I guess my point is that one of the most effective things about science was to get away from the specifics of the situation, get the generalities. But the data, I hope, about cities allows you to go back in the other directions, because ultimately I think people want specific solutions. Yeah, you can take ideas from elsewhere, but I do think you have to fit it inside the context where people live. And that's what I think is the value of having decent data to make those models useful. One of the frustrations in my area, because I would have started out doing a lot of modeling, so at the end of the day, I couldn't figure out, well, either I had become so generic that I couldn't see anything in the real world that corresponded to it against which I could apply it. But the models are getting better and better. They're closer and closer to reality. The problem they have is they have no reality against which to run the models. And they have no way of testing them because they haven't done the work.
Great. Okay, thank you. Any questions from anybody else? I know we only have a few minutes, but what is any questions from the group? Because I have a few more. Okay, well, just to jump in on that question of modeling, assessment and methods, your analytical tools and versus design guidelines, or not just either or, but and both, right? The metrics and the kind of performance indicators and how they relate to different spatial scales. What would you say, in terms of the gap analysis with respect to, say, modeling tools? Now, I know, you kind of linked that in your presentation, but if we were to kind of keep pushing in that direction, as far as, and this is the question I'm posing, is if we were to use this kind of urban design climate workshops that you're familiar with as a way of testing approaches and feed that back into the research world rather than the other way around. Oftentimes it's research goes to action. Here, there's a question of, could action go and provide a sort of information to the research world? Could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's easy. I think that the application part and the science part have largely occurred separately from each other. There's a lovely paper that was written by a man called Coburn a number of years back, but he took all the climate change people, and then he took a bunch of people who work in New York City parks, things like this, to have a conversation. So the urban climatologists or the global climatologists would say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to plant all these trees. If you plant all these trees, this is the outcome you'll get. And the parks people came back and said, there's no way you'll ever be able to plant that number of trees. So go back again and adjust all your models to account for the amount of space that we can look after. And that iterative process, I found fascinating, because it's suddenly forced, because a lot of modeling, a lot of science occurs almost in a vacuum, separate from the reality of having to make those types of decisions. And I think that the science can proceed with its simulations and with its, its evaluation using standard scientific tools. But the real challenge is to measure against reality. One of the most exciting stuff I've seen is the work that one of your students is doing at one stage on modeling that part of New York that had all the canals in it that was appallingly polluted. I read about it afterwards. But I found that urban scale building energy modeling stuff to be just incredible, because suddenly I saw the potential for actually making decisions about how to allocate things next to each other geographically to make sense. So I've been doing the same thing here with the student here in Dublin, who's take a relatively poor part of Dublin where there's a big, big development going in. And suddenly you could ask questions about, okay, if the development goes in, what's the effect on the climate? And you could ask things like, if you want to be a good neighbor and you come into a neighborhood which is relatively poor, what are you going to do for your neighbors? You're not going to bring them the cake anymore, but you can send them your energy. Because all these new buildings are extremely efficient, they should send energy to the other buildings. Now, it turns out this space we have is a bit like some of the ideas I saw in New York, happens to be next to the 17th century canals. So here's an ancient, or very old transportation network, which now is suddenly a water source for cooling energy and a CHP system. Next to that is also a transportation hub where there's an electrified train system. So rather than seeing the city with all its pieces all separated, you now have the possibility, I think, for creating neighborhoods and for designing it using these tools and then to see what the outcome is. So I think that's the most exciting stuff I've seen for years, because suddenly the indoor space and the outdoor space are back together, and they're back together in a space that I can actually walk around.
That makes a lot of sense. We talk a lot about that with smart grid and energy transfer at that sweet spot, which is kind of the district scale, is what you're mentioning here. Well, listen, Gerald, we were really fortunate to have Gerald Mills present.
Can I ask a question, Jeffrey?
Yeah, very quickly, because I think we're supposed to end a couple of minutes ago, but go ahead, Roberto, please.
Yes. So I was wondering, how do you do this kind of experimentation? Because as you keep talking about different tools and simulations, I think it's not going to be very real or close to reality, as you were mentioning before. So do you have to wait for accidentally the government giving some kind of changes of environment to be able to do some experiments? Or you actually have to communicate with them and then try to convince them to do some changes and also do experiments where you can actually do some adjustments in the future?
Can I just be clear, which question are you asking me? For example, are you talking about running a big model for an entire part of a city, or?
Yeah, for a city model, maybe a neighborhood model, because the scale is quite large. So I think that simulation probably is not going to be really close to reality. And the problem is that it could be so expensive that doing adjustments could be very risky.
Well, what can I say? I can tell you that in they're running the unified model, which is in the UK, and they're running in the background down to 100 meters. 100 meters. So they're giving predictions about air quality on your street. Now, here's the thing. That's only happened in the last 10 years. If I roll on the clock another 10 years, I'm convinced that they'll be able to model down to a given scale. The question is, will you be able to validate them and be able to use them? The urban building energy models that I was just talking about there, it's freely available. Now, the problem I have is the sophistication you need to run those models and the data you need to gather is quite a lot. But I've done tests myself comparing the results of those models against officially measured building standards, and it's pretty much spot on. Now, ask yourself, how precise do I need to be to make a decision? Right. If I've discovered a part of the city that's actually decrepit, needs major retrofits, and if I have a model that says, all these various options that you can do, these are the best options to yield the best impact for a given investment, it seems to me that I have a pathway to follow. Yeah, I think the models are getting down to that point. Seriously. Now,
yeah, and it's maybe a combination of design guidelines too, right, Gerald? I mean, it's not all model based. It could be broad set of guidelines as well.
Well, the question was about the modeling. I think the modeling is good enough to make some policy decisions and to evaluate what the impacts those might be. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that the models are neutral. They're up to the user to actually make the judicious use of them to inform the best policy. But I think the models are getting very good. And as I said, some of the progress that we're talking about has happened extremely quickly. Now, all I can say to you, I've been working in this area for 30 years. There's been absolutely zero investment in cities apart from air quality. Apart from the air quality issues, there's been no investment. If I went to any part of America and I started looking for databases that would tell me about the construction of the place we actually built, it's not, we're not talking about the bloody moon, we're not talking about the ocean. There's no data. Isn't that amazing? How much effort would it take to gather the information that we need to do the types of things you're describing? It's only by having a framework that I think it can make progress. But I don't think we're that far away. I think the real challenge is to include the humans into the system, the behavior systems, the patterns of movement. But again, I see progress in that also. So I wouldn't be as, I'd be more positive. maybe because I've been in it longer, but I'd be more positive about the potentials. The real challenge, I come from a wealthy city, you're in a wealthy city. Can we do this in Delhi? Can you do it in Bangalore? These are the real questions. And if you can't do it for them, it's pretty much pointless because that's where the game is in the future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time, so I would like to thank Cecilia. Did you want to say any last words?
Well,
Thank you so
Gerald,
much.
thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for giving the talk and making it so professional and going into the University of Dublin this is the first time I see a real lecture
Yes.
in a long time.
Yes. How wonderful.
Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gerald.
Okay,
Thank you very
take care of
much.
yourselves. Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you.
Have a good
All right,
weekend,
you
everybody.
too. Cheers. Bye-bye.